March 2021. Thanks again for coming to Wednesday Night at the Lab. I'm Tom Zinnan. I work here at the UW-Madison Biotechnology Center. I also work for the Division of Extension and Wisconsin 4-H. On behalf of those folks and are the co-organizers, PBS Wisconsin, the Wisconsin Alumni Association, and the UW-Madison Science Alliance. Thanks again for coming to Wednesday Night at the Lab. We do this every Wednesday night by Zoom 50 times a year. Tonight, it's my pleasure to introduce to you Adrian Treves. He's a professor at the Nelson Institute. And I'm now going to ask him the 5 questions. I forewarned him what they were, so he can answer any way that he would like. Adrian, where were you born?
West Lafayette, Indiana.
Holy cow. And where'd you go to high school?
Princeton High, public high school in Princeton, New Jersey.
Very good. Were your parents academics?
Yes, my dad, but not at Princeton. He was at the state school, Rutgers.
Oh, very good. 2 land grants.
Mm-hmm.
Purdue and Rutgers.
That's right, yeah.
And then where'd you go for your undergrad and what did you study?
I was at Rice University in Houston, and I studied biology and anthropology.
Boy, you went to 3 universities in a row named for people.
I never thought of it that way.
Wow. Huh. And where'd you go for your master's, PhD?
That was a combined program. So I was in Cambridge, Cambridge, Mass, at Harvard University.
And what was that program in?
At the time, it was called anthropology, biological, but they changed names. So now I think it's human evolutionary biology.
And then did you go other places before you landed here in Madison?
I came to Madison as a postdoc and then left for the nonprofit environmental sector for 5 years before coming back to Madison as academic staff and then as in my tenure track position that I'm currently in.
Very good. Tonight, you'll be talking with us about wolf policy and its effects on illegal killing, human tolerance, and recovery. Really appreciate it. Hope everybody will join me in welcoming Adrian Treves to Wednesday Night at the Lab. Go ahead and start whenever you'd like.
Thank you so much, Tom and Bia, and I really appreciate the hosting. I really appreciate all these folks who've made time on an evening when they might have other things to do, like binge watching or just getting a good night's rest. So I'm going to try sharing screen here. We'll see if that works and get right in. Yeah. All right, except I just hid some of my slides with this Zoom thing. All right, let's try that. All right. So folks, it's a privilege to be talking to you tonight. Thanks for making time. And I'm going to be describing research mainly on wolves, 3 different subspecies or species and 4 populations of wolves here in the US, but I'm also going to litter it with photos and stories of other carnivores. And the story I'll tell is basically the culmination of 20 years of research. And when Tom kindly invited me to speak back in the fall, things were a little busy, a little hectic, and I decided to postpone. I didn't think it would be controversial at the time. Tom seems to be looking forward to the controversy. I don't particularly relish it, but my talk's organized in 3 parts. I'm going to address this idea that for some is counterintuitive or doesn't seem to make sense, makes them scratch their heads, the idea of killing wolves to conserve them. And then talk about an idea about that blood buys goodwill, a widespread idea, especially in wildlife agencies. And I'll end with rethinking lethal management of our native carnivores. So what is this idea of killing wolves to conserve them, and why do I call it that? Well, there is a long-standing idea over a century old about hunting as a means of conserving native species. And I'm showing you a photo of African lions because this idea of hunting as a conservation strategy owes its roots partly to trophy and safari hunting in places like Africa, and folks like President Teddy Roosevelt, who was a champion of the idea of the sportsman hunter who would help to conserve wildlife rather than exploiting it commercially. And so what we saw in the 20th century, the late 19th century and early 20th century in the US was the rise of this idea of the sportsman hunter who would do what was called regulated hunting as a way to stop the extinction of so many wildlife species that were being exploited commercially, mainly for meat markets. So you've seen photos probably of the hundreds or even thousands of waterfowl, the deer that almost went extinct in Wisconsin. All of this was due in part to commercial hunting. And the rise of the sportsman view of hunting as a highly regulated practice is widely credited with preventing extinction of so many species in North America and other parts of the world. Now, this idea, to some extent, has become shortened or abridged in the way people talk about it. So they'll say things like hunting is conservation. You'll hear that construction. Or they'll say hunters are the conservationists. And in part, that's an abridgment, a shorthand, because it leaves out the word regulated from that equation. That it was the regulation of hunting, it was the control of overhunting, it was limits placed on hunting, which saved so many species like Canada goose, white-tailed deer, and wolves, my subject today. So that shorthand, that abridging of the idea that regulating hunting, that controlling hunting is going to conserve our wildlife species, that abridging has led to another idea among wolves. Among conservationists concerned with wolves. And that idea is that by making wolves a game species, we're going to advance their conservation. And it has several formulations or several parts to the idea. One idea is that hunters can provide revenue for habitat protection and thereby contribute to the conservation of lots of wildlife species. They could also contribute data and information for agencies. That's one idea. Another one is that by hunting controversial species like wolves, controversial meaning that they sometimes cause problems for the people that live near them, by hunting those controversial species, agencies may be able to raise tolerance for the survivors, raising tolerance for the surviving wolves so that the population persists. Another idea is that by turning wolves into an official game species that hunters are allowed to hunt, that's going to reduce poaching or illegal killing of wolves. And the third is that all of those factors together are going to promote restoration of controversial species populations. So we've been looking at this question for, as I said, almost 20 years. And with wolves, it's particularly acute. There's a particularly acute problem of poaching, of illegal killing of wolves. It's the leading cause of death in all measured US wolf populations. And if we add in the estimated cryptic poaching, that's the shoot, shovel, and shut up component of poaching. That's the concealed evidence, the destruction of radio collars, all of those things that scientists call cryptic poaching. If we add those two together, reported or observed poaching and cryptic poaching, these two causes of death are vastly outnumber all other causes of death for US wolves and in many other parts of the world also, actually. So the challenge posed by poaching has led to a lot of soul searching, a lot of deep thinking, and seems to have prolonged the period over which wolves had to be protected under the Federal Endangered Species Act. And I'm going to leave you with a thought today that that long period of endangered species protection could have been shortened and made less expensive for taxpayers and less harmful for wolves if we had gotten a handle on poaching earlier. So let's start with this idea of blood buying goodwill for wolves. Our research has failed to support that notion. Now, the idea behind it, of course, is that by allowing some legal killing of wolves, we're going to raise tolerance for the survivors, going to reduce poaching, and thereby foster the restoration of wolf populations and their recolonization of historic range. We've been testing this question, as I said, for almost 20 years, and there's 3 components to it. So I'm going to go through those fairly quickly, try to be clear, but not present too much data. So starting with human dimensions research led by Lisa Naughton, shown here on the left, a professor in geography at UW, we began to measure human attitudes to wolf policy in Wisconsin, and that was a crucial baseline. What followed in 2009 and 2013, I took up the lead on that, and we began resampling or remeasuring attitudes of the same individuals over time as a variety of conditions changed in Wisconsin. And we got the first hints in 2013 that tolerance for wolves, namely positive attitudes towards wolves, and the inclination to poach wolves were not going in the way expected. So what happened between 2001 and 2009 was a set of policy changes that liberalized wolf killing in the state of Wisconsin. These surveys were all done in Wisconsin with a mix of respondents from wolf range, from outside of wolf range, from inside of it, different stakeholder groups, interest groups. And we measured the same individuals over time, and we were tracking individual change in attitudes, and it wasn't going in the direction that agencies like the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service had predicted. In fact, tolerance for wolves was declining despite those policies of liberalizing wolf killing, and inclination to poach was significantly increasing. That research led us to support students in a postdoc. Christy Brown Nunez was a postdoc in my lab in 2015. She did focus groups with deer hunters in one set of focus groups, bear hunters who use hounds in a second set of focus groups, and livestock owners in a third set of focus groups. And she did those focus groups, all 3 of them, at 2 time points, so 6 focus groups. And the 2 time points bracketed a change in policy that liberalized wolf killing. She didn't find a change in tolerance. She found a tendency to increase the situations and the willingness to kill wolves illegally in the focus group participants, and a call for yet more killing of wolves in a regulated hunt. Then entered Jamie Hogberg, a master's student in my lab, coming a little bit after Christy, but publishing at the same time. You know how that happens. And what Jamie did was resampled our same respondents, the ones from our previous surveys, after the 2012 inaugural wolf hunting and trapping season. And she found another decline in tolerance for wolves, and specifically the most significant decline was among men living in wolf range in Wisconsin who had experience with hunting. So this is what led us to conclude that blood doesn't buy goodwill when measured by human attitudes, specifically the demographic group in wolf range most expected to become tolerant after hunting or after they practice lethal management. Their tolerance for wolves did not improve, and their intentions or inclinations to poach wolves increased over time. There are other elements of this idea of blood buying goodwill. One of them is that population recovery in the under the Endangered Species Act would be faster if there were some permits issued for killing wolves perceived as problems. And in 2016, 2017, Guillaume Chaperon, shown at left here, a citizen of France, but living in Sweden, doing his research there, he and I looked at the growth of the Wisconsin and the Michigan wolf population. And we found that once you controlled for the lethal management of wolves that had happened in 6 different periods between 2003 and 2012, once you controlled for that legal killing of wolves, there was a slowdown in population growth of approximately 5% that could not be explained by any other mortality factors and had to be caused by the appearance of a new type of mortality, we believed. And we hypothesized that that was this cryptic poaching. More recently, the research got a little bit more incisive, a little bit, the strength of inference increased, our resolution on the data improved. I'll describe that next. But that work with Guillaume Chaperon suggests that blood didn't buy goodwill when you measured it by wolf population growth in Wisconsin or in Michigan during that span of years, 1995 to 2012, when wolves were on and off the endangered species list or permits were issued for the state and federal agencies to kill some wolves perceived as problems. Now, fast forward to the recent years, in 2017, I started looking at individual wolf survival and the risk of poaching. And sorry, my photo's obliterating some of the text there, but it basically just says that I found that government agencies were systematically undercounting poaching because they were ignoring radio-collared wolves that disappeared. Then a PhD in my lab, who's now a postdoc, Dr. Francisco Santiago Avila, in 2019 and 2020, used advanced biomedical techniques under the guidance of Rick Chappell here at the UW Med School, and Francisco used advanced survival techniques and competing risk measures of hazard and incidence of different causes of death, but also the disappearance of radio-collared wolves. And he found a pattern that was truly startling, namely that during periods of policy that liberalized wolf killing in Wisconsin, a significant increase in disappearance of radio-collared wolves was observed. Then, most recently, and coming out in a week or two, actually on March 10th, Naomi Lau-Chauarn is leading an analysis of Mexican wolves that took Fran's analyses a step further and tested the ideas that, that policies could actually facilitate poaching. And she examined that, that problem, that hypothesis in Mexican wolves, which provides several advantages because Mexican wolves are part of a Fish and Wildlife Service recovery program where they were intensively monitored. More than half of all adult Mexican wolves were radio-collared, and the frequent monitoring made it possible for us to rule out immigration and emigration out of the study area. We also were fortunate that legal killing by the Fish and Wildlife Service, by the agency, did not change in hazard and incidence. And she found that disappearances of radio-collared wolves jumped sharply every time the Fish and Wildlife Service relaxed Endangered Species Act or ESA protections for those wolves. And not only that, that the poaching went from reported to this cryptic poaching, as if the poachers were deliberately intensifying their activities and going underground. Most recently, Suzanne Agan, a PhD student out of Antioch University of New England, did a similar analysis for red wolves. I'm going to show you a little bit of those data. So these are Wisconsin's radio-collared wolves from 1980 to 2012. And the orange line up top, the high one, LTF, stands for loss to follow-up. These are cumulative incidence curves for the disappearance of radio-collared wolves. The two orange lines indicate the different policy periods. The lower one, the solid orange line, is the period during which Endangered Species Act protections were the strongest. So Wisconsin's wolves got the strongest protection from federal law. The upper line, the dashed dotted one, is those periods when the Fish and Wildlife Service relaxed Endangered Species Act protections and gave the state some lethal management authority. Remember, these are radio-collared wolves disappearing. They're not dying from legal causes. They're dying from most likely from poaching. And we confirmed that with Naomi's Mexican wolf study, that this is not due to mechanical failure or battery failure of the radio collars. The timing is suspiciously short and much, much shorter than the rate at which radio collars stop functioning when a wolf is left to live out its natural life in the wild. These are some of the data from red wolves, which were reintroduced in North Carolina in the 1980s. And the data span the entire the entire reintroduction period. I have a picture bottom left to show how similar red wolves are to coyotes, especially under field conditions. It can be difficult for experts to spot the difference. And so we start to suspect that coyote hunters may be targeting red wolves intentionally or unintentionally. The graph at the right shows the black line is FU for fate unknown. Those are radio collared wolves that disappeared from the red wolf reintroduction area. Again, closely monitored, virtually every adult has been radio collared. So we know these red wolves are not leaving the area or emigrating out of it. They're simply vanishing either because their collars fail or because they've been killed by poachers who then concealed the evidence by destroying or tampering with the radio collar. The black line for fate unknown, which we hypothesize is cryptic poaching, you can see a tight correlation with the green bars, which are reported poaching, where the authorities discovered a red wolf killed by illegal means. So these now 3 populations we're talking about have very strong evidence for this effect of policies that increase cryptic poaching. I'm just going to show one more graph and then circle back to explain what all of this means. This is Naomi's data for the Mexican wolves, again showing 2 policy periods, just the same as the previous graph, and the loss to follow up those radio collared wolves that disappear. So what we're finding here is a pattern that can't be explained by any seasonal or disease effects across the range of 3 different populations of wolves, where every time the government changed its policy to liberalize wolf killing, whether it's red wolves, Mexican wolves, or Wisconsin wolves, every time they did that, there was a significant increase in the disappearance of radio collared wolves that happened much, much too early for it to be battery failure or mechanical failure. Also, we don't know any force that could make a policy change how the radio collars work, nor do we know of any mechanism by which a policy change might lead to migration by the wolves. And that's been ruled out now by the Mexican wolf and the red wolf studies. So we believe in the case of Wisconsin wolves that we're seeing a spike in poaching, and particularly a spike in cryptic poaching as poachers basically become more covert and more active in killing wolves illegally. So this is exactly the opposite of what governments predicted when they used the shorthand blood buys goodwill. They predicted that people would be more tolerant of wolves if some legal killing were allowed. We find instead that their tolerance expresses itself as a sharp spike in poaching. Also, the concealment of evidence, which is, these are environmental crimes, and taxpayer money and taxpayer investments in these wolves are being destroyed by the poachers, in addition to depleting a public trust asset that belongs to all of us, that is part of the legacy we pass to future generations. So we got multiple crimes going on here, and a situation that would have required more intensive law enforcement. However, the government agencies were convinced by their own often repeated notion that blood buys goodwill, even as the data was accumulating since 2013, that it didn't seem to be working that way, either in the realm of human attitudes or in wolf biology, whether it's population dynamics or the survival of individual wolves. So blood doesn't buy goodwill measured by wolf survival either. So this has led me to be outspoken in rethinking lethal management. And here it's important to take a step back. The argument for killing wolves, and many large carnivores is not simply that people's tolerance will be improved or that poaching will decline. There's also an argument that you hear very often around the world that lethal management of carnivores is going to protect livestock. Well, we've been studying that since 2005 too. And we came together with teams from around the world, many different backgrounds, many different institutions, some of them working for government. And we started to look at that problem. And the way that I've looked at this problem is that predator control is an intervention, just like medical interventions. And we have a well-established standard of scientific evidence before a medical intervention can go to market, right? It's called the gold standard, the randomized controlled experiment, rigorous safety tests, phase 3 clinical trials. We hear a lot about this these days because of the pandemic. Well, the same really applies to predator control. The idea being one has to randomize the treatment or the placebo condition, and better yet, reverse those. Now, why does one need this gold standard in predator control? Isn't it good enough, the common sense that tells you if you kill a predator, you're going to save livestock? Well, it actually isn't good enough because the most pernicious bias in science, any kind of science, including predator control, is selection bias. And there's also a risk of treatment bias. Selection bias occurs when the researcher thinks the treatment's going to work and convince themselves of that. Perhaps they treat the livestock herds that are most likely to benefit from it. So that kind of unconscious researcher bias can be ironed out with randomized controlled trials. Other forms of selection bias might be to treat different herds differently, depending on their vulnerability. So I've been advocating the gold standard experiments and doing them with my lab, with my grad students, and studying other people's experiments around the world. And here's a little bit of what we found. In 2018, we published in PLOS Biology, led by Lily Van Eden, with 21 authors from 10 countries. And this review, this is the first worldwide review, has been followed subsequently by something like 8 other studies, all finding similar things, namely that there's never been a gold standard experiment on lethal predator control on native carnivores. So there's an exception for Australia, where some non-native carnivores have been studied in this way, but there's never been that gold standard experiment on lethal predator control, native predators, published in a peer-reviewed literature anywhere in the world. That is worrisome, and it starts to get worse when we look at what kind of experiments have been run with lethal management. We find it's a lower standard, what I call the silver standard, or before and after comparison of interventions, which basically, when you don't randomize, this kind of silver standard study is done by basically injecting every subject, or whatever, treating every subject, letting some time pass, and then looking at the outcomes, right? Whether the piglet's happy or unhappy at the end. And this has a lower strength of inference. It's lower by at least half because time is an important variable. Things change over time. Animals get healthier if they were ill, and livestock sometimes become safer or less safe as time passes and predators move around the landscape. So the same applies again. And the reason I'm introducing this lower standard of inference, the silver standard, is because it's most commonly used on lethal methods, on lethal control. Now, again, I get to feature the work of my postdoc, Dr. Francisco Santiago Avila, in 2018 in PLOS One. He studied Michigan's lethal control of wolf program for a whole set of years, 1998 to 2014, in which they had 230 verified cases of wolf predation on cattle. And he examined the outcomes of lethal management. This is silver standard because the farms were followed depending on which intervention they received, but there was no randomization. And we're just looking at the outcomes by the end of the year at each of those farms. He found something counterintuitive, but common sense can be misleading. That's why we need science. And he found that the risk for livestock actually tripled for farms that were 6 to 15 kilometers away from the farm targeted for lethal control. Remember that a farm may encounter problems the wolf and call, the farmer may complain and call for lethal control. And he found actually that there was a 25% reduction in risk for those farms, not significant, but notable. However, there was a 75% increase in risk for farms in the neighboring township. And then if you went further beyond 15 kilometers, you'd get another 23% decrease. So a net 25% increase in risk overall. And he found it didn't matter how many wolves were killed on the original farm. Now, we don't know the mechanism for this, but there's increasing evidence and some hypotheses are really being developed now to explain this, that says that when you break up pack structure, it's a team, they hunt as a team, they defend a territory as a team, they cooperate to reproduce. When you break up that team with lethal management, the survivors, having lost their teammates, go for the more predictable, possibly the easier prey. And livestock are far more predictable than white-tailed deer in our region. So this is a silver standard study of lethal management of wolves, and currently it's the best available science. We're still calling for the gold standard randomized controlled experiment, hasn't been done yet anywhere, but this is the best available because we use the same methods as another study in the Northern Rockies that had a different conclusion. And we found that they left out too much information to be sure of their results and that they biased their tests towards lethal control. So we're calling for that gold standard experiment on lethal control and a moratorium until it's done, because it seems to actually be raising the risk for livestock here in our region. Now in 2016, me and my co-authors published a review focused just on Europe and North America, and looking at the silver and gold standard for predator control across all the studies we could find, peer reviewed, as long as it was a working livestock farm and the study involved wild predators. And we found a surprising dearth, very scanty evidence out there. Of 26 studies that met our silver or gold standard, we had to exclude 15 of them as unreliable because they're scientifically biased. I'm not using bias here in the sense of a cognitive bias or the common English use of the word bias. I'm talking about scientific bias, meaning the accuracy or precision of the results was called into question by serious issues with the methods. Of the remaining 11 studies, we only found 3 gold standard and 8 silver standard. This is lethal and non-lethal predator control. So the 3 gold standard experiments were all done with non-lethal methods, leading us to conclude that the standards of evidence have been higher for non-lethal methods, and that they showed effectiveness of non-lethal methods, which I'll discuss in a moment. An even more concerning conclusion of this result was that lethal methods for killing predators in other parts of the world, not just our study of Michigan, showed counterproductive effects of a higher livestock loss after lethal control. So this seems to be building a body of evidence that says we either need the randomized controlled experiment on lethal management, or we need a complete rethinking of how this is used to manage predators. So here are 3, study that came out later, the 3 non-lethal methods that have been subjected to the gold standard experiment, the randomized controlled experiments, and proven effective against different kinds of predators. We have livestock guarding dogs tested in Michigan against wolves and shown to be effective. We have fladry, that's that red flagging. It can be yellow, actually the color doesn't matter. And the flapping in the wind doesn't matter. It's a visual deterrent that we don't quite understand why wolves avoid it. It's now been tested on coyotes in my lab and in captive conditions. We tested it in the field. It can also be designed to apparently to repel coyotes from livestock, but fladry is a Polish word. It was devised by hunters to kill wolves. When long ago, maybe millennia ago, wolf hunters discovered that wolves didn't like to cross this vertical flagging. So fladry has been tested with gold standard experiments, and in our region, actually in Michigan, proven effective to keep out wolves. We also tested it, but with deer carcasses as a attractant, and wolves would not cross that fladry line. Upper right is an experiment done by my student Omar Orens. I'll talk about more in a moment. that's with fox lights. I'll describe those. And finally, yes, I am showing you the rump of a cow that's painted with eye spots. This is a study from Southern Africa. Those eye spots were tested in a randomized controlled experiment and appeared to protect the cattle from lion predation, if you can believe it. The hypothesized mechanism is that the lion is fooled into thinking that the cow has seen it because of those eye spots on its rump. Crazy, huh? All right, so a word here about the design of these experiments, because there are limits to non-lethal methods, and the experiments reveal those limits. My student, Dr. Omar Orens, shown at bottom right, now working for Panthera, a nonprofit that saves wild felids. He managed to recruit 11 owners of alpacas and llamas in the high plateau of Chile. We're shown there in that Andean high plateau. Those alpacas and llamas face predation by pumas and by the Andean fox. And he set up fox lights at the sleeping sites of the alpacas and llamas in the wild. And now fox lights are triggered at night. They produce a random set of colored lights that move, kind of look like somebody waving a flashlight around in the dark. And they charge with solar batteries by daytime. We added to the gold standard, as is often done in biomedical research, by doing a crossover design or reversing the treatment. So midway through, the randomly selected herd switched conditions from treatment to placebo or vice versa. And we did some blind analysis, again, aiming to reduce researcher bias at every step we could. We found that the fox lights were effective in deterring pumas. It went from 7 in the placebo control to 0 in the treated sleeping sites. So it seemed effective against pumas. Ironically, the fox lights were not effective against Andean foxes, with 25 attacks on the treated sleeping sites and fewer on the placebo controls. So one of our recommendations to the manufacturer is to rename it for Chile and not call it fox lights, because it didn't work against them. But that kind of underlines one of the issues with non-lethal methods. They might be particularly specific to certain predators, and they have to be designed carefully for the livestock owner and their operation and their animals and how they husband and manage those animals. So that's nothing new. Lethal management also needs some tailoring and specialization, but it's important to keep in mind there is no one-size-fits-all panacea cure-all for predator control. We don't have the results yet, but my PhD student, Naomi Laucharn, shown at left, about to climb onto her ATV and act as a range rider, or her colleague, Joe Engelhart, shown on the right with his ranch hand, riding horses as range riders. This is a new technique getting a lot of attention, a lot of interest for the big open public grazing allotments in the US West, and in this case in Alberta, Canada. So Naomi is doing a randomized controlled experiment on range riders to see how effective they are in protecting cattle in an open range setting against grizzly bears and gray wolves and cougars and black bears and coyotes. They got it all up there in Alberta. So stay posted. I'm hoping Tom will invite Naomi to give a talk on this exciting project sometime in the near future. So listen, where does it stand, this notion of killing to, blood buys goodwill, or killing to conserve? Well, our research didn't support 3 of the main claims. And what we're left with is frequent suggestions that one has to hunt wolves and other predators to control their populations and to control their distribution, or that hunting is required for their conservation to generate those funds for habitat restoration, for research on wildlife, etc. Well, this begs some questions. Are we controlling for the sake of controlling? Are we trading money for lives? So even if it's true in a particular situation, these fact claims are not scientific claims. They arise from value judgments. There's a judgment that we want to control. Somebody wants to control the distribution or the numbers of predators. Somebody has judged that a certain kind of money, hunting money, is preferable to say, non-extractive, non-consumptive money. I don't know if you knew that to actually feed wildlife, if you just want to watch them in Wisconsin, you have to buy a hunting permit. So is that hunting money? And the visitors to our state parks always list wildlife watching and bird watching in the top reasons for going to the state park. And state park revenues far outnumber hunting revenues. So they're questioned. These are value judgments about where our source of money comes from and what kind of control we want to exert over the native predators in our regions. And then we have to ask ourselves, whose values are being promoted? Are wildlife agencies actually representing the broad US public and its values? These are important questions as social norms have changed over time. These are the references I cited in this talk, and I'm happy to make those available. They're all free on my website if I'm a co-author on them. I'm happy to make all of them available to people who are interested. I do want to thank you for your attention. I know this is a controversial topic, that there's lots of interest and different views, and I hope we can keep it civil and collegial, and I do welcome those questions. I think I'll end with suggesting that our methods of predator management, and especially lethal management, need to be reevaluated, both from a values perspective, as social norms and values for nature, even values for livestock, have changed over time, and because the scientific evidence suggests that lethal management is not doing what we think it should do, and that non-lethal methods have proven very successful in protecting livestock, if not other human interests. So I'm going to stop sharing, but I do have some other slides if certain questions come up, so I might share those as well. Thanks for your kind attention.
Thank you very much. The floor is open to questions. As I mentioned very early when we first came on, Bia, Mom, and I will be able to watch the chat. I'd be happy to welcome any stated questions. We'll go back and forth on between the stated questions and the chat. Are there any stated questions that people would like to unmute and come on and ask Adrian? Adrian, why don't I start off then by asking, I was very interested that the DNR decided that they were going to have a hunt in December, and then the lawsuit came through Jefferson County, and within a matter of a few days, we had a 3 to 4 day hunt that had a quota of 119 and 216 were actually taken. What can you tell us about the reasoning behind that? And I was particularly surprised that the interactions with the native tribes, that they did not sue to stop that. I don't know enough about it. I just anticipated that they would. What can you tell us about what's happened here in Wisconsin in the last 5 weeks or so?
Sure, Tom. So I could probably go on for 40 minutes just about recent events. Let me recap a few of the points you made, add a little detail, and see if that triggers enough interest. It is a very controversial topic. So after the federal delisting of wolves from the Endangered Species Act went into effect on January 4th, quite quickly, a committee of the state legislature asked the Natural Resource Board to declare a wolf hunt in February 2021. The Natural Resource Board voted 4-3 against that initial committee proposal. And I believe I've been told that the reasoning was that they feared a lawsuit from the Ojibwe sovereign tribal governments of Wisconsin, because the Ojibwe view, as I understand it, they view wolf as brother or companion in their creation story. They revere the wolf, and they get frequent reminders of the importance of the wolf in their ecosystems and the cultural importance of the wolf for their people. I'm not a tribal member, so I'm doing my best to convey their views. Now, although the NRB voted against, the Natural Resource Board voted against that hunt, Jefferson County Circuit Court judge heard a case from a Kansas group and ruled in favor of that Kansas group and ordered the DNR to start an immediate hunt, although at this point there was something like 10 days left in the legal hunting season, so it had to be extremely rushed. And as I understand it, the Jefferson County Court did an interesting legal maneuver that if it were done all over the place would probably trigger an outcry. That judge left the case open, although he ordered the state to do something. So the state tried to appeal the order in the Wisconsin Court of Appeals, and the Wisconsin Court of Appeals declined. They said they don't have jurisdiction because the circuit court judge did not close the case. So I'm just telling you that that's a legal loophole that others are going to exploit, and there's going to be an outcry over it. However, the consequences of that were that the DNR executed this rushed hunt. The Natural Resource Board voted again and agreed to do the hunt, and they set the quota at 200 based on some considerations from the last regulated hunting and trapping season and hounding season that we had in 2014. At that point, the tribes asked for much of the quota. They asked for almost half of the quota, as is their right in the ceded territories where most of the wolf range occurs. In those ceded territories, the state and tribes are co-sovereigns, co-managing wolves and other harvestable assets. And the tribes wanted to reserve 81 wolves for non-extractive uses because they revere them, to protect those wolves. So the quota, the official quota was 119, as you said, but then 216 wolves were killed before hunters stopped, before the hunting season was closed, and every single zone went over quota in a period of 72 hours. And I'll just end by saying this indicates how risky the state population goal of 350 wolves is if in 72 hours hunters could kill 216. And that's just the registered legal hunting. There's all that cryptic poaching I talked about earlier. Thanks, Tom.
You're welcome, and thanks for dealing with that controversial issue. I'll come back to that with more questions after other people have a chance to ask. Bia, do you see any questions in the chat?
There was a question. There are questions coming into the chat.
Okay.
I have a question, kind of cryptic, because I don't know anything about it. I just picked up a book. This is me talking. I had just picked up a book I thought was interesting because I'm interested in causal analysis rather than gold standard stuff. I'm interested in how far we can go with causal analysis, the Judea Pearl's works and things like that on how you can do solid analysis with observational data when you really can't do gold standards, placebo effect, that kind of standards. And so I picked up a book on biology. It was called by Bill Shipley, called Biology of Causal Analysis or something like this. Are you familiar with that kind of work and how short of gold standard randomization that can be used in your field, for example?
Thanks for that question, Lawrence, if I'm seeing your name correctly. So back in 2011, I made a similar argument. We published a risk map for livestock across Wisconsin, and it's still visible on my website. You can type in your address or any address you care to in Wisconsin and see what the risk of wolf attack on livestock is in that particular section. Actually, it's a very fine resolution. And that risk map was based on correlations, but a correlation with a very high true positive and very low false negative rate, around 92%. And then we verified that correlational model on future data that we had not had for analysis. It was reserved, or it was collected after we finished the model and published it. And we found a very, very high predictive power. So I would argue that we didn't actually figure out the biological mechanisms that make livestock vulnerable to wolf predation, but we detected some correlates of vulnerability that are highly predictive. And so they must be close to the biological mechanisms, whatever those are. And I made the argument, and I still make the argument, that that's good enough for management if you get extremely high correlations and they predict data that you didn't have when you were modeling. That's only sort of a partial answer to your question. Right now, I'm somewhat hung up on our inability to confirm the effectiveness of methods of predator control unless we do the randomized controlled experiments. I'm hung up on that because I've seen so many errors in using lower standards of evidence. But I admit to not having read widely about those other methods for causal inference. I tend to be a little suspicious of studies that are purely observational or correlational because of the amount of confounding variables and how much we researchers want so much to discover something important or to detect, find the truth. That can really mislead us, I think. I hope that answers a little bit.
Thank you, Larry. Bia, do you want to read the next question from the chat? I see Matt Sevchik.
Yeah, that's what I'm seeing too.
Go ahead.
So Matt says, based on the tolerance percentage decrease and increase in poaching, in your opinion, are we starting to go down the path of what happened in Yellowstone? Yellowstone.
You must be from Wisconsin.
I'm not entirely clear what the questioner means by down the path of Yellowstone. Maybe if Matt wants to type that, just a clarification in the chat, I'll address what I think is at the heart of that question about tolerance and poaching. I actually think, I used to say that Wisconsin had a quiet recovery of wolves, in the sense that it wasn't all inflamed by controversy, deeply emotive, a political struggle. I no longer feel that way. I think we've surpassed the Northern Rockies even in the intensity of conflict, political conflict. But maybe that wasn't the nature of the question. So Matt, if you want to just clarify in the chat, that'd be great.
And then Bia, if you can watch for that, or if Matt wants to unmute and pose the question, that'd be great too. Bia, what's next?
In the meantime, I have a question.
Great. Hi, Cindy.
I spoke with Kevin Warnke from the DNR, who seemed to think that this excess of wolf quota was not going to be a big deal. I beg to differ. So can you maybe expound a little bit on what this is going to do for the wolf population in general, that so many of these wolves were taken in such a short period of time?
Yeah, Cindy, thanks for that question. I also disagree with Mr. Warnke on this one. You'll see a number trotted around where they divide the 216 legally taken by the population back in May, and that's a misleading number. It's misleading because, for one thing, there's all that cryptic poaching that we've estimated at close to 100 wolves killed illegally during the wolf hunt this past February. The second thing to keep in mind is that the population number we have from May of 2020 steadily gets depleted the way if you don't get income and you're paying your bills, your bank account gets steadily depleted. That's what happens to the wolves. They only breed once a year in a big pulse. And we have not counted the wolves that survived, that were born last summer and survived to November. We haven't counted those yet, so we have to estimate them. And then if you estimate that way and count in the cryptic poaching, I estimate we probably, while the wolf hunters and poachers of Wisconsin and out of state knocked our population down by half. That's a conservative estimate, but I have taken a precautionary approach in using the lower bound of the May 2020 wolf population estimate. What worries me as much as that shocking number and that's derived from our peer-reviewed published models, that number. What shocks me as much as knocking our population down by 50% almost is that it happened during the wolf mating season, the time when the alpha male and alpha female bond and mate and hopefully have a pregnancy and a litter. And it's very possible with hounding, snowmobiling, nighttime hunting, trapping, that the hunters and poachers killed a lot of alphas. So we have no idea how many they killed. We will never know because we're not collecting the right data, and the hunt messed up the census, which happens at the same time of year. So we're not going to know how many of these packs actually reproduce this year to produce the next crop and refill the bank account, so to speak, to use that metaphor a little too much. So again, our work is published in top-ranked international journals, peer-reviewed, has never been undermined by any other findings, no other credible findings. So I find the DNR is painting a rosy picture. It's excessively optimistic. And I'm concerned, finally, I'll wrap up here, but I'm concerned that the 350 state population goal could be so low as to be crazy to have another hunting season. It could be the wolves of our state could be largely functionally eradicated if we have another hunt like this. Thanks for the question.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Adrian. So now we're going to do one from the chat. Do you have one lined up there, Bia?
Yeah, well, Matt posted kind of his explanation, and I think you just answered it with, he said, with how rapidly the populations declined due to poaching and hunting to the point of being wiped out, which you kind of just touched on.
Yeah, thanks, Matt, for that question. Idaho is showing worrisome tendencies. Wyoming has classified wolves as predator, which basically means vermin to them, and Montana has a bill to do the same. So yes, it's worrisome just as well. All of these actions by states are sort of justifying concern about the Fish and Wildlife Service having delisted wolves in the first place.
Sandy Shepard asked in the chat, why do you think the DNR or the Fish and Wildlife don't accept the science and your research data?
Okay, there's layers and layers to that question. It's a super good question. And part of the answer has to do with the difference between the statutory and Wisconsin Supreme Court common law rules about how our agency should be a trustee versus the reality on the ground of how our agency caters to narrow interest groups and seems to think its only source of funding comes from hunting and trapping and angling and hounding. So there's a disconnect there between the rules and laws on the book, common law and statute, about the role of our agency as a trustee. And what I mean by that is this is an ancient legal principle around the world, and it's been supported in the US by US Supreme Court common law since 1842, saying that wildlife are a public trust. In other words, we are the guardians for future generations. We, the people of the US, and the Wisconsin Supreme Court affirmed that for Wisconsin's DNR. It is a public trustee, and that means it should be accounting transparently and in a sophisticated way for the state of our wildlife, should be prioritizing preservation, not use, and it should be responsible to all beneficiaries, not to narrow interest groups. So part of the answer to your question is there's a disconnect between the way our agency acts and the laws and statutes and court decisions that actually govern how it should be acting. It's up to us, the public, to hold it to account, to hold it to those standards. But at the moment, in my opinion, our state government is listening more to particular segments of the public than to the broad public. And so we as the people have to speak up about that, I believe. And the other part of your question relates to how the agency views science. And My experience as a scientist speaking to the agency, I was once funded by the DNR. My experience is that they kind of don't like scientific conclusions that go against their value judgments and preferences. So a paper coming out, led by me, coming out in March, in a few weeks, is going to talk about transparency, about wildlife decision-making, and how to separate value judgments from the science. Because I'm not claiming I should be making value judgments for the state, but the separation between some individuals' value judgments and the science is impossible to see currently in our state government.
Thank you for the question, Sandy. Thanks for responding, Adrian.
Gotcha.
We just did one from the chat. Does anybody want to open up your microphone and ask a direct question?
Well, can I just jump back in quick? And before we go, Adrian, before we leave tonight, would you just tell us what we can do to get this wolf maybe relisted with the Biden administration?
Thanks for that question, Cindy. I've been trying my darndest, and so I wish you the best of luck, and I hope it'll work. I would suggest letters to your federal Congress people, letters to the administration, letters to the editor. What we have to do is convince President Biden and his administration that his initial instincts were right. And what I mean by his initial instincts were all those executive actions passed in the first week that they were in the White House. Those executive actions effectively told all of their agencies to review the rules passed during the Trump administration and review them to make sure they lived up to the same values as the Biden administration embraces, namely equity, justice, protection for public health, and protection for the environment. And unfortunately, Assistant Director Gary Fraser of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service responded to that request by the Biden administration to review the wolf delisting, responded to it very negatively and very briefly, saying they considered it and they're going ahead with that rule. So we face a double challenge. It's not just the Trump administration that delisted gray wolves. The Obama administration did it in 2014 and got slapped by their peer review panel. I was not a part of that, and retracted the delisting during the Obama administration. Trump administration did it again and ignored the scientists. They got slapped again by their scientific peer review panel. I was on that. So what we have to hope for is that the Biden administration sees how popular wolves are, how the science was ignored, and how important wolves are for the health of our ecosystems and for trust in government. And the Biden administration has to overrule its own Fish and Wildlife Service and maybe sweep out some of the holdovers from the last administration. Thanks for that question. I feel somewhat impotent, right? Because all the science doesn't seem to be shaking the opinions of some of these decision makers. I wish they were based more on science and less on personal value judgments, honestly.
Thank you. Next one from the chat, Diana asks, could you put cameras in the tracking collars that are activated when the collar is tampered with? I suppose one could. They'd be tampered with too. So I think that our solution, so what you've touched on with that question is one of our major recommendations to state and federal agencies and tribal agencies. And that's to be transparent about the disappearance of radio-collared animals, whether it's wolves or grizzlies or, whatever those biologists out there are tracking and monitoring, be transparent about how many disappear. Let's stop discounting them, because that's the single biggest scientific error made by wolf management agencies for the last 30 years. So your question's a good one about how do we get better data, and that's up to the agencies. If they tell us when they started collaring, when they started monitoring a collared animal, and when it disappeared, scientists like myself would be able to do these analyses much more quickly. We actually had to do a Freedom of Information Act to get the Mexican wolf data out of the Fish and Wildlife Service. And the head of research for that Mexican wolf recovery program had the darndest response when we just asked him as colleagues for the data. He said, no, I'm working on my PhD. I need the data.
which just struck me as the biggest personal conflict of interest I'd ever run into. So we need reform of the science and agencies for one thing. Then the second thing we need are effective interventions against poaching. We need law enforcement to be given back its teeth here in the state and elsewhere in the US.
Can you clarify for me, is the Mexican wolf like the Canada goose? It's the name of a species, or is it a wolf in Mexico?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, it's a subspecies of the gray wolf that was reintroduced to New Mexico and Arizona. It's native to the United States. It's just called the Mexican gray wolf. Sorry, I should have said that way earlier. Thanks, Tom.
Oh, it's all right. Thank you. Appreciate it. Bea, do you have any others in the chats?
Sandy Rotter is wondering if you've done any more drone work.
Sorry, no, I can't say anything smart about drones. You want to tell me what you know about their use in wildlife research?
Sandy, you want to chime in? If not, Eve Emschwiller. Eve, can you pronounce your name for me? I don't know if it's the SH is a sh sound.
Yeah, it's Emschwiller.
Thank you.
And I was just thinking that maybe I didn't really frame it that much as a question, so maybe I can
Sure.
do this slightly differently. Hold on, let me.
And do you and Adrian know each other?
Yeah, hi, nice to see you
A
again.
little, yeah, hi. Yeah. Oh, I forgot the background. I was thinking that when you were talking about the Chile part, I've seen an Andean wolf, and it's a lot, fox, sorry, Andean fox, and they're a lot smaller than a full-grown alpaca or llama. And so I mean, this might have nothing to do with it. The reason that it worked on one and not on the other may have nothing to do with this, but I was thinking, well, a puma is big enough to kill a llama or alpaca. The fox is like smaller than an adult camelid. So would that have anything to do with the idea? I mean, is that correct that the Andean fox is working in packs and in order to take down a full-grown camelid, unless they're only taking off babies? And if so, could that have anything to do with the idea that it didn't work? That no.
That's a great question. You're breaking up just a little bit. Yeah, you're breaking up just a little bit. So let me go ahead and answer the part of the question I heard, and then if I miss anything, just jump right back in.
Adrian, could you restate the question so that the listeners know what question you're?
Yeah, sure. So Eve is curious about why our experiment in Chile with the fox lights might have worked against pumas, but not against Andean foxes. And Eve suggests a really interesting hypothesis we haven't considered, that maybe because the foxes work in teams, they're pair bonded. Sometimes they'll have juveniles with them. So you're 100% right. That because of their pair tactics, their predation in pairs or in teams, that perhaps the fox lights don't work as effectively. That's super interesting, Even I've never actually considered it. We're right now working on a much simpler, like simple-minded hypothesis that the foxes actually see lights from settlements and houses frequently, that they have a long history of coming close to housing to pick up garbage and trash, or perhaps prey on a cat or something. So they're actually habituated to lights, whereas pumas have much larger ranges. They see very few people in this depopulated part of the country. And therefore the pumas are more scared by lights. That's our simple-minded hypothesis. But Omar, who's leading this research, has a second experiment in another part of Chile, where we have both of those wild predators and we have feral dogs. And he's finding that lights are not working there even for the pumas. So we're beginning to get a little more resolution on what might be going on. We think it has to do with habituation to the lights over time.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Did I miss any part of your question?
No, that was pretty much it. I was just, it just sort of occurred to me that having seen the fox and thought,
Yeah, I mean, you
Oh,
have a
those
good
foxes
point.
are small. And to
Yeah, they are
that
small.
question. So yeah,
Yeah, they're
yeah,
small.
okay.
They,
It's not
they-
as small as our little red foxes, but certainly smaller
That's right.
than a full grown.
And Eve,
That's
so
right. They're bigger than our red foxes. They do hunt the young of alpaca and llamas, and sometimes they can pull down an adult if it's already weak or lying on the ground. But it's rare. You're right.
Okay. Okay.
And
Okay. Good.
Eve,
Thank
so
you.
folks at home,
Thank you.
so the folks watching, can you tell them about your background and your work in South America real quick?
Oh, well, yeah, I do field work in South America in the Andes on a tuber crop. So it's not a potato, but it is one of the other tuber crops. There's 4 different plant families that were domesticated for tuber crops in the Andes thousands of years ago. And I study one of the other ones that is not related to potato, but is still grown and eaten like a potato. And so I've done field work in the Andean region. And
Very good. Thanks for.
to see
As a plant person, I'm envious. So that's great.
right. Yeah.
If I could throw in an editorial comment that sort of dovetails with what Eve is talking about, it can be super informative for my field to look at historical patterns of domestication and how people raise livestock traditionally. So I learned about a non-lethal method of protecting livestock from working in Bolivia with folks who had very, very rudimentary technology because of poverty and their remoteness. The technique they used was called chaku, where before letting their alpacas and other camelids out into the grazing areas, the whole village would go out and basically form like a fire chain or be like drivers. And they would make noise, they would light fires, they would bang on pots and pans and shout and walk through the habitat to scare away foxes and pumas and so forth before they let their livestock out to graze. So I'm all in favor of those kinds of historical perspectives on what people do. We learn most of our predator control techniques from talking to farmers.
Thank you. Anyone else want to chime in, or if not, I bet Bia's got another question from the chat.
I have a question about deer populations and auto collisions and insurance companies. What is the value of wolves in controlling the deer population, and how valuable are wolves to insurance companies in reducing auto collision bills?
Wow. Okay, interesting question, and it's a frontier in our knowledge. There's only been 2 papers that I know of who've measured this. One for cougars in the northeast of the U.S. and one for wolves here in Wisconsin. So I'm going to direct you to Dawn Waller, who worked with the team that was trying to quantify deer vehicle collisions and the effect of wolves. I don't have a figure off the top of my head, but I do have some numbers that are illustrative, I think. So the last time I saw an estimate of our deer population in Wisconsin, it was around 1.1 million deer, right? And human hunters take like 400,000 approximately per year. Our vehicles and our farmers, vehicles kill about 50,000 deer a year, and the vehicles get damaged clearly. Our farmers kill a lot of deer to prevent crop damage. Wolves are estimated to take 25 per wolf per year. So if we have 1,000 wolves, there's 25,000 deer being eaten by the wolves. So, compared to all the other things that are killing deer out there, wolves are a very small part of the problem. We don't know exactly how deer respond to wolf predation and if it increases vehicle collisions or decreases vehicle collisions. So I'm sorry to leave you with kind of a dissatisfying, I don't know answer, but that's the way science works. We have to do careful studies before we, can conclude safely.
Did you want to have a follow-up on that? I see the light, but I don't.
Yeah, see the flickering
I'll
light.
pass on that.
All
Okay,
right.
thank you. Anyone else, or otherwise we got a couple more in the chat.
I have a question.
Hey, Raj.
Thanks for the nice presentation, Adrian.
Thank you, Raj.
You mentioned about poaching being a big factor in the elimination of wolf population. I was wondering whether we could do something on the lines of what was done with Cecil the lion. It was collared, and a hunter who always goes there to hunt for animals, a dentist from Minnesota, and he happened to kill Cecil, and that caused a worldwide uproar. So I was wondering whether we could take a young wolf, collar it, and advertise it to the general public that somebody can adopt it. And I feel younger generation will be very receptive, and they may be motivated to some extent to start protecting the wolf population. I don't know, what do you think of it?
Thanks, Raj. Really important question. And I've worked with a team of Canadian researchers led by Dr. Chris Darramont out of UVic, British Columbia, looking at cases like Cecil's and others. There was a wolf in British Columbia that became famous, was being followed by everyone. There were social media posts, and people were collecting video footage of that wolf as it moved around urban areas in British Columbia, and it too died and triggered a huge movement and a wave of concern. And Dr. Darramont, he says that the social license to operate framework for hunting should be considered as a useful way of understanding public acceptance of hunting, especially of carnivores, because public opinion has turned so negative about hunting of carnivores, as opposed to, say, hunting of deer for food, which the majority of the public still support. But the social license to operate framework suggests that the public gives license to groups that benefit from, interest groups that profit from hunting, and that that's being eroded for the hunting of carnivores, and that the best way to reverse that is for the operators themselves to clean up their act and self-police. So I think what you're pointing to is a way that the broader public that doesn't believe in hunting for carnivores can draw attention to the lack of social license, make our governments aware of it, and to some extent name and shame those who are transgressing. So I don't know if that would work the way you suggest for wolves, although there was a famous wolf, Chris, that I tell the story of up in Vilas County, Wisconsin, who just survived for so long. She lived to almost 11. She was an alpha female for a long time, and then died at a poacher's hands at that venerable old age. I think more could have been made of Chris's biography. It was sort of a heartwarming story, and even its end was not a complete waste. If you think about the attention, it focused some of us researchers on the problem of poaching. So Raj, I think it's a great idea. The DNR used to allow its wolf census takers, the civilian volunteers who counted wolves, to also adopt a wolf pack. I think they should resume that activity, which is right in the spirit of what you're saying, I think.
Thank you, Raj.
Thanks for that.
Hey, Adrian, this is Matt Sevchek. Just to kind of follow up with Raj's comment or question there. If I'm not mistaken, the state of Wisconsin, I know whitetail deer hunting, they do allow animals that are collared to be shot. So to Raj's point, I don't think that's really going to stop the situation, because if a hunter pays for that license and that's what he's got in the crosshairs, if the DNR allows an animal that's been collared to be shot, they're not going to second guess. But it's, a person pays for that license, and most hunters are conservationists. That's why we want to help control situations and not let them get out of hand. So just to kind of follow up for Raj.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of agree, Matt. The majority hunter is ethical, I believe, and they're hunting for food. They're not being wasteful or disrespectful. We need the ethical hunters to speak up, because the unethical ones, the delinquent hunters, are not listening to me. I'll tell you that much. But point well taken, Matt. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. Bea, can you read the one from Mary Madigan, unless Mary wants to chime in?
Yeah, I can sure read it if Mary doesn't. Mary says, what is the scientific community doing to educate the public on the importance of predators, especially keystone species, to the health of the environment?
Well, we're doing things like this. I spend almost as much time reaching out to reporters, to groups like this one, as I do writing scientific articles. It's become a necessity because basically no one can read the mass of peer-reviewed science that's being published now. Not even researchers can catch up. So the role of science reporters has never been more critical in my mind, and the depletion of newsrooms is frightening, frankly, because we have, there's less bandwidth for scientists to be heard by the public. Luckily, at the same time, I think social media and things like this, a Zoom conference, do give us a bigger megaphone. Now, the second part of your question was about the ecological role of top predators. There's a risk of overstating. And I think that might have happened with the Yellowstone wolves. Research that wasn't gold standard may have been overstated, and it got picked up and people ran with it. But that's not to say that top predators don't have super important roles. They do. They have disproportionate influences like keystone species do, disproportionate influences on their ecosystems. And that's probably because 90% of their prey escape, but they escape afraid, right? That ecology of fear is super important. So I try to talk about it most of the time. I didn't tonight just because of the topic that we chose. I didn't realize how controversial it would be when I asked for March 3rd from Tom. But yeah, I could have talked about the ecology of wolves as well if I'd thought about it that way.
Thank you. Other questions?
I'm seeing a hand raised by, is it Lorna? I think you've been trying to, are you muted?
Lorna, you need to unmute. You're muted.
I saw her waving patiently, snaps.
Okay.
There
I
we
get
go.
from a culture that doesn't understand that hunting is not valued, but what do hunters say about this, and what do the organizations of hunters say about this? I mean, there's some very powerful hunters organizations, aren't there?
Give you half an answer because I'm not a hunter. And I'll turn it over to somebody who is a hunter, like Matt, for instance, who spoke earlier. But I will say that certain powerful, rich groups based out of state were responsible for the lawsuit that triggered this February 2021 wolf hunt. So there are some rich and powerful hunters groups that practice, in some cases, extreme hunting. They're not the majority, but maybe a hunter among us would speak to that.
Anyone want to chime in?
So this is Matt again.
Hey, Matt.
I will say that I am not a wolf hunter. I do hunt the whitetail deer. And I guess one question that I was going to bring up next here, the whitetail population in the North Woods of Wisconsin and even the UP of Michigan had been depleted enough that I believe it was 2 years ago, they did not allow antlerless deer to be harvested because the population was so low. And Adrian, I don't know if you can attest to this, if this was due to the fact that the wolf population has grown large enough that they're seeing some predation up there. And I guess if the deer population in the Northwoods has been depleted enough. I have a cousin that has property in southern Shawano County that they do have a pack of wolves. I think he said there's like 8 members of the pack on his property. And I'm just wondering if the whitetail population has been depleted enough in the north that that's what's causing the wolves to migrate a little bit further south, because there's a much larger deer population, you know, central and southern Wisconsin, if we're going to see that wolf population expand further south.
Hey, Matt, I want to just say I appreciate how calmly and civilly and respectfully you asked that question, and I want to, you know, I want to match it. I want to be as respectful and collegial. So, you know, wolves don't really migrate in the sense that I think you mean. They do spread, of course, geographically, and they establish new packs. But once a pack's established, it shifts very little year to year. So certainly the increase of the wolf population in the last 5 years of ESA protection would have led to recolonization and establishing new packs, maybe further south, definitely. Whether that reflects a shortage of deer for the wolves, I couldn't say, and I doubt it, because wolves are sort of, they're low on the totem pole of risks to white-tailed deer, right? Humans obviously come first, but even among the predators and our vehicles, wolves are below all the other predators, right? That's a study out of UW-Madison that quantified that. I'm talking about the big predators, right? Black bears kill more deer fawns, coyotes, etc. So I sometimes think of wolves as being treated as a scapegoat for the difficulties of hunting in some deer management units. And I'm not going to argue with anybody who says they have difficulty, you know, compared to past years. That's probably true. Anyway, certainly it's their perception. If they're having more difficulties, then they're having more difficulties. So sometimes people mention that it's got to do with habitat, weather, disease. Those factors typically regulate herbivore populations like white-tailed deer more than the predators do, more strongly. And then there's things that shift the deer's ranging patterns. So they're just not found in the same places they were a decade ago, maybe. I'm not a deer expert though. So I don't know what you think about that, Matt, if that helps at all.
Yes, it did a little bit. Thank you.
Thank you.
And Jay, I see you came on. Did you want to ask a question, Jay, or you just? Okay. Well, it's 8:30. Sometime in the summer when we can get together and have a beer on the terrace, I would love to go through the team hypothesis with you. I had never thought about that, but of course, you know, we watch all, you know, you think about in sports, in military units, the cohesiveness of the squad or the platoon, that not all members of a team are created equal. And if you take out the alphas, if you take out the wrong kinds of folks, you're taking expertise that's hard to regain and cohesiveness that's hard to regain. And it's not just the numbers that you've lost. So don't know anything about it, but that's why beers on the terrace are a good idea.
Well said, Tom, and I'd love that beer with you. I'll buy.
Well, you buy one, I buy one. We'll alternate, kind of like chats and spoken questions. So one more call for, oh, it's like last call. Last call for questions. If not, thank you. Go ahead.
Raj has a good question in the chat.
I have a question.
Okay, Raj, and then I've got one else in the chat. So I want to do one more from Raj and one more in the chat.
Adrian, if your prescription for maintaining wolf population was adopted by the state of Wisconsin and they suspended hunting, what do you think will be the wolf population in 5 years? And what's going to be the impact on livestock population?
That's a super good question, Raj. Let me start by answering it kind of in reverse order. I predict that livestock losses are going to be high this year because of the number of teams broken up by the wolf hunt. So we're going to have loners, teenage wolves out there who have no team to help them, and they're going to turn to livestock. So I predict if the state invested in those effective non-lethal methods, we could bring livestock losses to record lows, never to zero, but to record lows. By the way, if the state adopted my recommendations, it wouldn't justify hunting wolves for livestock protection or tolerance. It would play straight with the public and just say transparently that some members of the public want to hunt wolves for recreation, and it would make a small quota for those few people. That's what a trustee would do, and be transparent about it. So Raj, thank you for asking me that question so I could make that point, which I should have made during my talk. And I actually don't have a projection for how what would happen to the wolf population if it were fully protected and everyone followed my plan. But I think they would start to come closer to areas like Dane County. So for instance, I just heard a coyote pack. I live in near West Madison. I just heard a coyote pack in Owen Park. We live with them without conflicts, and we've surveyed the people in our neighborhood about coyotes, and they're extremely positive. They love coyotes in our neighborhood. So I think we can learn to coexist with wolves if we learn to protect our domestic animals, because wolves avoid people like the plague for the most part. Virtually every wolf will flee a human. One thing that I'm just going to go riffing here, and I'll be quick. One thing that people misunderstand about wolves is that when they don't run immediately and they look at you in the eye, people interpret that as bold because very few animals do that. But think of an animal that does that all the time with us. Our domestic dogs look us in the eyes. They can interpret something about what we're going to do, maybe our emotions, based on looking us in the eyes. And they inherited that from wolves. So don't expect a wolf to not look you in the eye before it runs, but it'll run, especially if you wave your arms and make a lot of noise.
Oh, I'm going
Sorry,
to run.
I went on too long. Tom, you have to cut me off.
No, I will be running far faster and sooner than the wolf. Thank you very much, Raj. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks,
B,
Adrian.
are we good there?
Thanks, Tom. This was awesome.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank
And
you. You're
hope
welcome.
to see you next week for the next Wednesday night at the lab. And thank you very
Thanks,
much.
everybody.
Great.
Thank you,
Thanks, Peter.
Adrian. Thank you, Tom.